Hey guys, we're in Revelation 11 this week. We are halfway through the book, and this chapter is so dense that we're devoting a whole week just to Revelation chapter 11. This passage is saturated with Old Testament imagery, and we could say this about virtually every chapter in Revelation, but if we miss the Old Testament imagery in chapter 11, we're going to totally miss the point. So let's break it down. In verses 1 and 2, John is given a measuring rod and told to measure the temple of God, the altar, and those who worship there. Why in the world does he need to measure it? Our Western brains typically think of the mechanics of measuring and the purpose of measuring and the logistics of measuring. We have a very concrete, pragmatic way of thinking. But John is giving us a more theological and spiritual message here. By the way, many evangelicals make the same mistake with the creation account in Genesis. We want to figure out the mechanics of it when the biblical author is actually communicating a theological and spiritual message. And as for John, he's drawing upon a couple of important Old Testament passages to convey his message here. In particular, Zechariah 2 and Ezekiel 40 through 48. Back in Zechariah, we have an angel with a measuring rod with which he's going to measure Jerusalem. In Ezekiel, we likewise have an angel with a measuring rod, but he's going to measure the temple and everything in it and the courtyard around the temple. In Revelation 11, John himself has the measuring rod with which he's told to measure the temple, altar, and the people of God inside it. Now, when we read through all these visions, we can see that the area inside that which is being measured, it's a place that's both sanctified and safe. Nothing can harm someone who's inside the area that's being measured. So the act of measuring likely represents God's protection over those who are inside the holy perimeter. Now, Zechariah's vision pertained to the whole city, but in Revelation and Ezekiel's vision, the area is narrowed down to the temple. And what does the temple represent? It's the very presence of God. Let's keep our brains in the Old Testament for a minute and think about it. When Moses first led the children of Israel to construct their tabernacle, it was so that God's presence could dwell among his people as they traveled through the wilderness. And when Solomon built the first temple in Jerusalem, the point wasn't to have a really fancy building. The point was to construct a place where people could encounter the presence of God. So the essential aspect of the temple is the presence of God. And now jumping forward again to the New Testament, we don't have a temple because we don't need one anymore. And why don't we need a temple? Well, we know that Christ made the temple and the Old Testament ritual system obsolete. So now you and I are the temple in which God's Spirit dwells. Paul tells us this explicitly. He says, "Do you not know that you are a temple of God and that the Spirit of God dwells in you?" That's 1 Corinthians 3:16. So go back to Revelation 11, 1 and 2. Measuring the temple simply represents the eternal security of the believer. Nothing can separate us from the presence of God or harm our spirit because we're sealed by him. And of course, this accords perfectly with everything we've learned so far throughout the first 10 chapters of Revelation. Now, John also tells us that the court outside the temple and the holy city, the area which has not been measured and protected, this area will be trampled for 3.5 years. A partial time, a short time, a period of time that will not last forever. And this area outside the temple likely represents our physical bodies, our earthly lives. We will face persecution and our bodies may be harmed. But what's on the inside, our spirit and our eternal destiny, cannot be touched by the enemy. Okay, take a deep breath. We'll discuss the temple and city imagery again when we get to Revelation 21 and 22. But for now, let's move along to the two witnesses. These guys have had quite the sensational portrayal in novels and movies and popular theology. But if we simply look to the Old Testament, we can easily see where John's going. He is still referring to the early chapters of Zechariah, in which the high priest and governor of Judah who are symbolically depicted as olive trees and lampstands, exemplify faithfulness under persecution. Much of the surrounding imagery also brings to mind times when Israel's very existence was threatened. For example, during the ministries of Moses and Elijah. And that, by the way, does not mean that these two men are literally Moses and Elijah. Now, we also know that lampstands represent churches because John has explicitly told us so. So these two men represent the church, which remains faithful under persecution. There are likely two witnesses because in the Old Testament, two witnesses were required to confirm the truth of a testimony. So even though there are two, they do represent the one church. And the text confirms this because if you look closely, you'll notice that they communicate with one mouth. That's in verse 5. And they follow in the footsteps of Jesus, just as the church is supposed to, by facing persecution, even to the point of death. And of course, they're resurrected to eternal life, just as we will be. So what's the takeaway here? John is showing us that the church will seem to be completely wiped out before Jesus returns. Rather than being raptured away, true believers will face suffering, humiliation, and death. And it's not a very fun message, but it is one we need to know so that we don't fall away from our faith when we encounter hard times. But here's the beautiful part. After the passion of the church, after the church sacrifices itself for the sake of the gospel, many people give glory to the God of heaven. The church's faithfulness leads to the salvation of countless individuals. What a beautiful message, and what a blessing to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Take another deep breath, or maybe a sigh of relief, because that's a good place to stop for now. Take some time to process what you've learned, maybe even reread the chapter and rewatch this video if you have time. If you're feeling kind of foggy, congratulations, you're right with everyone else. Just keep digging in and you'll be glad you did.